In this module, we're going to be discussing corrections, in particular looking at the prison system. And again, keeping in mind that corrections is not exclusively about prisons. When an individual is convicted and a sentencing verdict is reached, even if they are released on probation, even if they are on parole, even if they are been issued a conditional sentence and to be served in the community, they're still under the correctional system. They're just serving their sentence in the community as opposed to in a correctional facility. But in this module, we're going to focus exclusively on the prison system in Canada. In particular, as part of this lecture, we're going to begin by looking at the role of prisons in the criminal justice system and in society as a whole. We'll talk about the structure of Canada's prison systems, looking at federal, provincial, and municipal prisons. We'll talk a bit about the correctional population in Canada, including some statistics, some characteristics of the population, focus a bit on special populations, including women and Aboriginals. And we'll then talk about the type of prisons in Canada, how they are classified, including different security classifications, and how prisoners are placed in different types of prisons based on security classifications. We'll then get into issues revolving around life inside a prison, with particular emphasis on such significant detrimental issues as violence, communicable diseases, and overcrowding. And then we'll end this lecture talking about the rights of prisoners in Canada. So when you look at the role of prisons in Canadian society, or any society for that matter, there's three basic models or approaches to the role that prisons play in society. The first model is what's called the custodial model, and this is basically about incapacitation and deterrence. So the whole point of the prison system and incarceration is to incapacitate the most dangerous criminals in society, or those most serious criminals, and that's to keep them out of society in order to protect society, to punish offenders and deter others. Another type of model is what's referred to as the rehabilitation model. The roots of the rehabilitation model actually can be traced back as far as the Reform movement, the classical school of criminology back in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries that advocated for the humane treatment of prisoners and also advocated for their rehabilitation. And this, again, is premised on the idea that prisons serve a role in treating and rehabilitating prisoners to ensure that they do not reoffend. The final model is what's referred to as the reintegration or risk reduction model, and this is the model that's perhaps most emphasized in Canada, the philosophy that tends to guide our correctional system. And the basic premise of the reintegration model is to help prisoners or help offenders reintegrate back into society. So the irony is that prisons play a bit of a dual role in society. Not only do they incarcerate and incapacitate offenders, but they're also meant to rehabilitate and reintegrate. So the irony is that once an offender enters, or while most offenders enter a correctional facility in Canada, the emphasis is on getting them out of that facility and back into society. Again, the argument is that the best place for offenders for their treatment and rehabilitation is in the community, in society, and not in prison. So within Canada, the reintegration model is considered the dominant philosophy of the correctional system in this country, and incapacitation or incarceration of offenders is really seen as the last resort, as we discussed in the previous lecture. Prisons are really for offenders who have inflicted the greatest harm on the community, and every effort is made at the sentencing stage in the criminal justice system to try to divert offenders into alternatives to prisons and keep them out of prisons. So again, it's a very small minority of offenders in Canada who are actually incarcerated within Canada's prison system. In Canada, the responsibility for corrections is shared between the federal and provincial government, So that pretty much echoes the responsibility for criminal justice in Canada as a whole. The basis for the split in correctional jurisdiction is what's known as the 2-year rule. An offender who receives a sentence or consecutive sentences totaling 2 or more years falls under this jurisdiction of federal corrections, whereas an offender whose prison sentence totals less than 2 years is the responsibility of provincial correctional services. Now, we also have municipal correctional systems, but they're really not correctional systems in the sense. They're basically prisons. They're prisons, lockups, and remand centers, and they're basically used for short-term detention. For example, after an offender has been arrested and before they've been released on jail, or if they have not been released on jail, they'll spend time in lockups, say during their trial. So provincial governments have jurisdiction over municipalities, so technically provincial governments have jurisdiction over municipal lockups. So again, the correctional system is primarily the responsibility of the federal and provincial governments. As far as federal correctional institutions are concerned, they are managed and fall under the mandate of Correctional Service of Canada, which is a branch of the Public Safety Ministry. The Correctional Service Canada is directed by a Commissioner of Corrections who is appointed by Cabinet, more specifically by the Prime Minister, under provisions of the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. So it's the Correctionals and Conditional Release Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that governs the operation, mandate, and other issues concerned with federal correctional institutions. The CSC has a mission statement that partly reads, quote, "The Correctional Service of Canada, as part of the criminal justice system and respecting the rule of law, contributes to the protection of society by actively encouraging and assisting offenders to become law-abiding citizens while exercising a reasonable, safe, secure, and humane control." So again, you see this dual mandate of incarcerating prisoners, incarcerating offenders, the custodial mandate of the correctional system, with the other mandate, which is to rehabilitate, treat, and to reintegrate offenders. As far as the number of federal correctional institutions in Canada is concerned, according to the CSC, there is a total of 57 federal correctional institutions, 6 of which are in Atlantic Canada, 13 of which are in Quebec, 12 in Ontario, 14 in the prairies, and 9 in the Pacific region, which includes BC and the territories. And in this slide, you see there's a breakdown by maximum, medium, minimum, and multi-level security correctional facilities in each region. And each of these federal institutions houses somewhere between 78 and 500 inmates. It will vary. The number of correctional institutions may increase or decrease in upcoming years. The federal government under Stephen Harper has indicated it will be shutting down some federal correctional institutions. However, at the same time, there is an anticipation that the federal correctional population may increase due to the tough on crime laws, the mandatory minimum sentencing laws in particular, that the Harper government has brought in. So these numbers are not static, they will change, and the question that many are asking is whether or not only will the prison population increase in recent years due to the Harper government's law and order agenda, but will there be an increase in actual federal correctional institutions to accommodate that increase in population? As far as provincial and territorial facilities are concerned, there are more than 150 provincial and territorial correctional facilities in the country, including youth facilities. I won't go into great depth based on province. There's a certain level of diversity, but there is a link in this slide and in the course module to Wikipedia that actually provides a pretty good overview and links to the different websites of the different provincial correctional facilities. Suffice to say, as we've discussed, provincial and territorial correctional agencies are responsible for offenders serving sentences totaling less than 2 years, and provincial correctional systems operate institutions at all security levels, so maximum, medium, minimum. They also operate specialized jails, detention centers, and remand centers, which constitute the point of entry into the institutional correctional system for most offenders, and these are primarily classified as maximum security. So these basically hold offenders who are on remand, so that is they're waiting trial or awaiting a bail hearing. Those who are sentenced to short terms of confinement, and also they operate as waiting prisons for those who are to be transferred to a federal penitentiary. Now, provincial correctional facilities also operate treatment centers that provide specialized and intensive treatment for special categories of offenders, such as sex offenders. And provinces also offer specialized prisons for women and for Aboriginal offenders as well. So as I mentioned, I can't go into great depth on the correctional system for each province, so once again we'll use Nova Scotia as a case study. The correctional system in Nova Scotia is under the mandate of the Correctional Services of Nova Scotia, which is part of the Department of Justice. And the Correctional Services of Nova Scotia basically is divided into two parts. There's community corrections and correctional facilities. So once again, this represents the delineation between offenders who serve time in a correctional facility and offenders who serve time within the community. And again, we're talking about offenders that have been sentenced to 2 years or less. And in total, there are 6 correctional facilities spread throughout Nova Scotia. And for more information on Nova Scotia Correctional System, there's a link provided in this slide and also within the module. So the mission statement of the Nova Scotia Correctional Services is to contribute to the maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society by administering community and custody-based sentences of the courts, providing safe and secure custody, direction, and control for the accused and convicted offenders, and to provide programs that address dynamic criminogenic factors and reintegration planning to facilitate the successful integration of offenders into the community. So again, it revolves around administrating programs, providing safe and secure custodial institutions in general, and with respect to the last goal, as we discussed, it's to help offenders reintegrate back into the community by developing a reintegration plan for the offender and supporting them in their reintegration. So once again, this is a reflection of the importance of reintegration in the mandate of the Nova Scotia Correctional Services. And so some of the values or principles that guide the mandate of Nova Scotia Correctional Services is safe, secure correctional facilities and healthy, supportive correctional facilities for all offenders and staff. Program and services based on high standards to achieve positive change in offender behavior and attitude. Services which balance deterrence, punishment, and rehabilitation, and partnerships with other correctional and community-based agencies. So again, you can see this reflects the multifaceted role that correctional services play in the criminal justice system. In particular, the third point, which is balancing deterrence, punishment, and rehabilitation. Now, as far as numbers or statistics are concerned with respect to the adult correctional population in Canada in the fiscal year 2010 and 2011, there are approximately 38,000 adults in Canada's prisons on any given day. So that was nearly 900 more than the year before, resulting in about a 1% increase in the rate of incarceration per 100,000 adults. So as far as the 38,000 correctional prisoners are concerned, or adult correctional prisoners, that represents about 0.1% of the overall population of Canada. Adults serving a federal sentence of 2 or more years accounted for about 36% of those in Canada's prisons. Another 29% of adults were serving a provincial or territorial sentence of less than 2 years, and the remaining 34% had been remanded to a provincial or territorial facility to await trial or sentencing. For the sixth year in a row, the provincial territorial custodial facilities housed more adults in remand than those sentenced to custody. So regardless, the rate of adults in remand was about 6% down from the previous year, which was the first notable decline in the remand population in over a decade. In contrast, the rate of adults serving sentences in provincial and territorial institutions actually rose 7% between the fiscal year 2009-2010 and 2010-2011. This is one of the few times the rate has actually increased since the early 1990s. The 2010-2011 rate of adults serving sentences in federal prison also rose from the year before, up by about 3%. So we're seeing a decline in the number of prisoners within remand, but we are seeing a slight increase in the number of adults serving federal and provincial sentences. And the question is why? Why has there been an increase? Is it due to policies, federal policies have been doing to crack down on offenders? So one of the questions that persists in any study of a correctional population is why is that population increasing or decreasing? Now finally, in addition to the adult population in correctional facilities, you also have offenders who are under community supervision. And the most recent statistics from 2010-2011 is that there are about 125,000 offenders who are under community supervision. So this is both federal and provincial. And the majority of those under community supervision are on probation. So at any given day in Canada, there's a total of 163,000 adults who are under the supervision of federal or provincial correctional system. And the vast majority of these, as you'll see in this slide, are under community supervision, and mostly those who are on probation. So just a few more statistics with respect to the correctional population. For those serving federal sentences, 47% are serving 2 to 3 years, 21% are serving 3 to 4 years, and 4%, only 4% are serving life sentences. Now also, as far as federal offenders are concerned, 95% of all federal offenders in the correctional population are male, and within the provincial correctional system, 91% are male. The median age is about 32 years old, and 17% of the federal population is Aboriginal, while 19% are provincial. And as we'll note later in this lecture, and it's what's noted in your textbook, is this is quite disproportionate to the overall population of Aboriginal people in Canada. In other words, there's a disproportionate amount of Aboriginal peoples in jail relative to their population in Canada. So now we're going to turn our attention to the types of prisons that are in Canada. And in particular, we're going to examine the types of prisons based on the security classification delineation. So in particular, we're going to look at maximum security prisons, medium security prisons, minimum security prisons, and multi-unit security prisons. And we'll also look at how the Correctional Service of Canada has adapted a new security classification system. And we'll also talk about how offenders are actually placed in prisons. So what are the criteria that's used to determine whether they'll be placed in maximum, medium, minimum, or multi-unit prison in Canada. So the highest level of security classification for a federal or provincial correctional institution is what's known as maximum security. These are highly controlled environments, generally surrounded by high security perimeter fencing or walls, guard towers. The inmates' movement is strictly controlled and monitored through video cameras and other surveillance systems. There's often solitary confinement for misbehavior or protection of offenders. Educational treatment programs may be available within the prisons. And again, maximum security prisons are those that house the most high-risk offenders, generally speaking. More specifically, these are offenders that are serving indictable offenses. In medium security correctional institutions, inmates generally have a greater freedom of movement than in maximum security prisons. But with that said, these institutions are still surrounded by security features such as high security perimeter fencing, topped with barbed wire, surveillance systems. There are training facilities as well as educational and treatment programs within medium security prisons. And in general, the majority of federal prisons are housed in medium security institutions. There are also minimum security prisons in Canada. Here, the environments allow for the unrestricted movement of inmates except during the night, and generally there's no perimeter fencing. The security is rather relaxed relative to maximum medium security prisons. Staff and inmates will intermingle regularly. There's private and semi-private rooms, and sometimes these are cottages or structured as cottages as opposed to jail cells. And there's also a number of work release programs, so inmates will come and go from the institution on a fairly regular basis. Finally, we talk about a bit about multi-level security institutions. And these are institutions that have one or more of the maximum, medium, and minimum security levels in the same facility or on the same grounds. So in some cases, there are distinct inmate populations within the same institution that, for security and safety reasons, are not allowed to commingle. So for example, in the Kent Institution, which is a federal maximum security institution east of Vancouver, there are three separate populations. So those in closed custody, those in general population, and those in protective custody. So again, the multi-level units will have several wings, each of which are dedicated to maximum, medium, and minimum security provisions, and these wings are generally isolated from one another. In 1981-82, the Correctional Services Canada actually introduced 7 different security levels, and these levels incorporate the medium, maximum, and minimum security classifications that we've talked about. So level 1 is what's called community correctional facilities. Level 2 are the first forestry and work camps. So these generally encompass minimum security institutions. So community correctional facility is generally a minimum security prison. At levels 3, 4, and 5, these constitute medium security prisons. Level 6 is maximum security, and then level 7 is what's known as special handling units for violent offenders. So these security levels have been developed to denote which security level a particular offender will be designated. For example, an offender who has been designated level 2 may be involved or sequestered into a forestry and work camp. Those designated as a level 3, 4, or 5 security risk will be in medium security, while those at level 6 will be in maximum security. So this is for the adult male population, and then in 1995, Correctional Service Canada added 6 management levels or security levels for women in female correctional facilities. As alluded to in the previous slide, the placement of prisoners in a correctional facility, maximum, medium, or minimum, is determined by certain criteria that determines both the risks of offenders, the risk they pose, but also their needs as well. So a classification system is an ongoing process that involves identifying the treatment needs of the offender along with the risks that he or she presents within the correctional system. The classification system also assesses the inmate's progress in altering his or her attitudes and behavior. So in other words, if an inmate is initially placed in a maximum correctional institution based on an assessment of high risk, if that risk assessment lessens while they're incarcerated, that inmate can actually be moved to a lower security level. So if they're initially incarcerated in a maximum security prison and their behavior improves, or the risk assessment is one that states they are less a risk to to cause violence in the prison, for example, then they can actually be moved to a medium or minimum security prison. So in some cases, you may have a minimum security prison in which the offender is actually been incarcerated due to an indictable offense or even a serious violent crime. Why? Because they have been classified as a low risk, and that's why they can be placed in a minimum security prison. So in determining the level of risks, prisoners are classified according basically to three criteria: the likelihood of escape, the likelihood of violence against others, and the likelihood of breaking rules. So even if an offender has been incarcerated based on a violent crime, and they are considered to be a low risk in these three categories, they can actually be in a minimum or more commonly a medium security prison. So maximum security prisons are really only there for prisoners who have a high likelihood of escape, a high likelihood of violence against others, and a high likelihood of breaking rules. Now, the initial classification decision is made after an offender is sentenced in a criminal court. So at the federal level for Correctional Services Canada, there's actually reception centers where offenders will stay for a period after sentencing, and they will actually be assessed, and their classification, security classification, will be designated after that assessment. And both the federal and provincial governments use standardized assessment instruments, and they'll also do standardized interviews as well. At the provincial territorial level, this classification may occur either during the inmate's stay in the remand center or on his or her arrival at a particular correctional facility. And so again, the assessments will occur before the inmate is transferred to a particular institution. But again, the assessments will take place throughout their incarceration, and it's a dynamic process in the sense that the assessment may change. They may go from being a high risk to a low risk, and so therefore they may actually be transferred from a higher level security classification to a lower level security classification. So as a inmate progresses through his or her sentence, ideally what the prisoner and the correctional system or correctional officials want is to move from a high classification, high risk classification, to a low risk classification. So they actually work their way through different levels of prison, so from maximum, medium, and ultimately to the minimum level security, where that'll be their last stop before they're released on parole. We'll now turn our attention to some special correctional populations in Canada. In particular, we'll look at the female correctional population in women's prisons, as well as Aboriginal correctional population. There are 5 regional facilities specifically for the female correctional population. This includes facilities in Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And the small number of regional facilities for women reflects the fact that relative to men, there are a minimum number of women incarcerated in correctional systems in Canada. These 5 regional facilities actually replaced the Kingston Prison for Women, which dates back to the early part of the 20th century, which was closed in 2000. So for years in Canada, we basically had one prison for women serving federal sentences. There's also a minimum security facility located in Alberta for Aboriginal women, which is a joint initiative of the federal government and the Samson Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. Located on the Nikanit Indian Reserve in Maple Creek, Saskatchewan, this facility for federally sentenced Aboriginal women offers a full range of correctional treatment programs that cater specifically to Aboriginal women. And it's unique in that it operates under the direction of a governing council composed of elders from the Samson Cree Nation, as well as other representatives of the Nikanit First Nation. Now, when we talk about female inmates in Canada, the first thing we need to acknowledge is that it's a very small number compared to male offenders. So only 2% of all federal offenders, so individuals serving time in a federal correctional institution, are female, 2%. So as we talked about earlier, 98% are male. So most of the female offenders in Canada are serving time in provincial facilities, which basically means that they are serving less than 2-year sentences. Most are for summary offenses, so short sentences, less than 14 days. Fewer violent offenses. A disproportionate amount are for property offenses or failure to pay fine. About a quarter of these are repeat offenders. And what characterizes female inmates is a number of socioeconomic or sociodemographic characteristics. So many are often quite poor, which would indicate or reveal why many couldn't pay a fine. Many are incarcerated due to prostitution offenses. There's often a very strong correlation between substance abuse and female inmates. There's an ongoing concurrence of theft and drugs, so drug abuse and theft. Shoplifting is a common crime among women, and many women who do shoplift have a substance abuse problem. Many women who are involved in the sex trade have a substance abuse problem. Alcohol abuse is a common characteristic of female offenders, and fraud is also a fairly common offense committed by women serving federal or provincial inmates. Many are also victims of sexual abuse and violence. So there's a fairly common profile of female inmates. They're poor. They've often been sexually abused as young children. They're often involved in such offenses as prostitution, theft, shoplifting, fraud, and many have substance abuse problems, drugs, alcohol, etc. As far as Aboriginal inmates are concerned, again, the most startling statistic that will jump out at you is that while Aboriginal people represent less than 3% of the national population, between 15 and 17% of the federal inmate population is Aboriginal. And when you look at the prairies, close to 64% of the federal inmate population is Aboriginal. So a male treaty Indian, so an Aboriginal person living in a native reserve, is 25 times more likely to be incarcerated in provincial jail than a non-native. And the problem is even worse with Aboriginal women. An Aboriginal woman is 131 times more likely to be incarcerated in provincial jail than a non-native woman. And so this is obviously a significant issue in Canada. The level of incarceration of Aboriginal men and women really is a reflection of the crisis in many Aboriginal reserves and among the Aboriginal population in general. It's beyond the scope of this course to get into why Aboriginal people are so disproportionately represented among the inmate population. But again, it's a symptomatic of much deeper social problems and institutionalized discrimination in this country. And one simply has to look at the horrible living conditions that many Aboriginal people have to live in, the terrible level of poverty and other problems on reserves. There is a high level of sexual abuse of children on reserves, a high level of family violence. There's a high level of substance abuse. And so all of these problems are symptomatic of the broader social problems being faced by Aboriginal people in Canada, and again, the institutionalized discrimination against Aboriginal people in this country. In addition to Aboriginal people, it should be mentioned that inmates, federal and provincial inmates in Canada, are also disproportionately black. So while African Canadians account for only 0.02% of this country's population, black men make up 7% of the federal institutional population and 11% of Ontario's institutional population. And black women make up 7% and 9% of these respective populations. So once again, You have a disproportionate number of African Canadians serving prison sentences, and one must again reiterate that this is reflective of broader social problems and discrimination that these populations face in Canada. A final characteristic that's very common among inmates in Canada is the high level of substance abuse as well as the high level of mental health issues among prison populations. So in general, the proportion of the inmate population that has a substance abuse problem or a mental health issue is far greater than the overall population in Canada. So many feel that in Canada the criminal justice system disproportionately targets people with mental health or substance abuse problems, and this is an obvious problem because the argument is that instead of putting these people in jail, we should be treating their substance abuse problems or their mental health problems. We now are going to discuss the issue of life behind bars, or life within a Canadian correctional institution. And we'll first begin by talking about one of the most important emphases of the correctional inmate's life in prison, and that is basically developing a plan to get out of prison, and that's commensurate with the reintegration principle that's so predominant in the Canadian correctional system and the Canadian criminal justice system in general. And then we'll also talk about some of the more salient detrimental aspects of life in prison, including violence, suicide, overcrowding, and communicable diseases. I'd like to begin the discussion of life in prison with the issues of case management and treatment. And both of these have an underlying current, and that is to ensure that the offender can be released from prison on parole and reintegrated back into the community. So the irony of Canada's correctional institutions is that while they're incarcerated, a great amount of emphasis is placed on getting them out of the system and back into the community, into society as a whole. So the underlying principle of case management and treatment is reintegration. Case management is a continuous process that extends from the initial entry of the offender into the system through their period of confinement and all the way to their release on parole. Now, the case management team is responsible for coordinating the administration and management of the inmate's sentence, and the core of the case management process is what's called the correctional plan. And based on the inmate's risk and needs profile, which was developed when they entered the system, the plan basically determines the offender's initial institutional placement, so what's their security classification, their training and work opportunities, and the conditions of their release. And really the plan is about working towards reducing the risks of the offender in reoffending and reducing their risks or their threat to society. So it's really all about managing their risks within the prison, which includes treatment and other programs and processes. But most importantly, it's managing their case so that they can be released through parole and back into society. So a number of assessment tools have been developed to assist case managers in prisons in planning, supervising, and making decisions around the inmate's case management process. So the instruments are designed to assess the risk posed by the offender, identify the treatment requirements of the offender, and determine whether the offender is ready to be transferred to a lower level of security or released from confinement through parole in general. So a key issue with respect to case management is the issue of treatment. And it's a very controversial issue of treatment, and it's probably most controversial because there's not a lot of treatment facilities within prisons. A small percentage of correctional budgets are dedicated to treatment. B, should treatment actually be offered in correctional facilities? Is this the best place to receive treatment? And C, Are inmates required to take the treatment? So treatment is actually not compulsory, it's voluntary. So it's really up to the inmate to determine whether or not they will enter a treatment program within a correctional facility. And there's various types of treatment programs. Some of those are directed at violent offenders. Some of those are directed at the causes of offending, such as substance abuse. The most common and the ones that are most funded are for sexual violent offenders. But again, sexual violent offenders are not required to take these treatment programs. If they do take the treatment program, then that is certainly taken into consideration as far as their risk assessment is concerned and as far as their eligibility for parole is concerned. But again, they're not required to take the treatment process. A violent sexual offender who refuses treatment will most likely be denied parole. And those who are willingly involved in treatment programs tend to have their risk level reduced and tend to be released into the community through parole. And again, it really varies obviously among offenders, but again, treatment is a critical part of the correctional systems, although it only receives a small proportion of resources. Many believe that rehabilitation generally doesn't work in prison because of the institutional atmosphere. And that's why reintegration is so important, because again, the argument is that once they're released into the community and are under intense supervision, this community environment contributes to a much more fruitful and successful treatment process. But again, life in prison is very much characterized by the offender working towards the release from prison through parole and reintegration back into society. And once an offender enters prison, a case management plan is developed and everything is done to ensure that their risk assessment is positive and that they can be released on parole. So we're going to shift gears a bit in our discussion of life behind bars and talk about some of the more negative aspects of life in prison for inmates. The first obviously is violence. Violence is obviously a significant issue within any correctional institution. The statistics show that violence in Canadian institutions is an ongoing problem. Major assaults declined during the 1980s and increased in the 1990s, so there's a bit of a roller coaster as far as violence in prison is concerned. Much of the prison violence occurs in maximum security institutions, which is not surprising since these are the highest risk, most violent offenders. Much of the violence is inmate on inmate violence. It's often drug related in the sense that it's either over the violence is over an issue of drug trafficking within prison, or an inmate is on drugs. And it's also gang related, and this is a growing issue in Canadian institutions, Canadian correctional institutions. Gangs, and not only gangs that are informed in prison, but gang members that come to prison and continue to have allegiance to those gangs, and which is obviously a problem when there are other rival gang members in that same prison. So gang membership has shown to increase violence in prison, increase assaults among inmates, and because of that, rival gangs are often housed in separate sections. Rival gang members will be in separate prisons for that matter. So a growing challenge for prison administrators in Canada and throughout the world for that matter are inmate gangs that have their origins in the community and then import their affiliations and tactics into the correctional institutions. It's estimated that 1 in 6 federal inmates is affiliated with a known gang or an organized crime group, and this appears to be on the increase. This has been attributed in part to increasing legislative and enforcement efforts that have targeted gangs in the community, so you have more gang members and more members of organized criminal groups in prisons. And there also has been an exponential growth in Aboriginal gangs in the prairie provinces, and Aboriginal youth are particularly susceptible to Aboriginal gangs. So within prisons, Aboriginal gangs have become a significant problem. And again, this is part and parcel of the overall broader problem of the disproportionate number of Aboriginal inmates in prisons. And another issue, again, has been organized crime, in particular Hells Angels members. A number of Hells Angels members have been convicted and imprisoned in recent years throughout Canada, and there's an increased fear that the power of these inmates within correctional institutions in Canada, in particular in maximum security prisons, have led to the formation of gangs and rival violence between rival gangs, Hells Angels and its rivals within inmate prisons. So there's a number of well-publicized and recorded incidents of Hells Angels members either being attacked or coordinating the attacks on other rival gang prisoners in the same correctional institutions. A few other issues with respect to prison violence in Canadian correctional institutions. While there is a high rate of inmate-on-inmate violence, attacks on prison staff are fairly rare. Throughout Canada, there's fewer than 10 attacks on prison staff in this country. Sexual assaults on female staff do occur, but again, these are fairly rare. And those that are the offenders in these situations tend to be inmates with psychiatric problems, history of sexual violence, those that have been rejected for parole. The homicide of prison staff is extremely rare, as are prison riots. These are quite rare in Canada, and those that do occur have been triggered by prison conditions, abusive staff, inhumane treatment, and among things, a lack of access to television. But in general, prison riots are quite rare in this country. The issue of suicide is also a prevailing issue when you're talking about life inside prison. Suicide is in fact the leading cause of death in Canadian prisons. The suicide rate among inmates in Canada is at least 2 times higher than the general population, and nearly half of all deaths in prison are the result of suicide. And this is usually by hanging, and it's usually early in the sentence of the offender. And suicide rate is particularly high among Native women. Communicable diseases are also a key issue when discussing life in prison in Canada. In particular, HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis are rampant in Canadian prisons, in particular federal institutions, but also correctional institutions to some extent. And the causes of HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis is generally from unprotected sex between inmates, as well as the sharing of needles for drug use. And there's a real epidemic of these communicable diseases in the Canadian prisons. The rate of HIV and AIDS and hepatitis is a number of times higher than the general population. But this is an issue that tends to be pretty much ignored by the rest of society. As is other detrimental issues like violence and the high rate of Aboriginal offenders, for example. Some other salient issues that one should touch upon when talking about life behind prison is illegal drugs. Drugs is still a major issue within prisons. They're smuggled in. They are also trafficked in prison. They're sold, and they are smuggled through offenders. They're smuggled in through the friends or loved one offenders, and even prison guards and lawyers have been identified as people involved in smuggling drugs. But this is a particularly significant issue within prisons is illegal drugs. Another issue that is actually one that can be better controlled by officials is overcrowding. Increasingly, you're seeing the issue of overcrowding of prisons in Canada come to the fore. And this is because of an increased incarceration rate of offenders. And the philosophy that of the get tough on offenders, which is very much reflected in the law and order agenda of the Conservative government. So you have certain Conservative governments, whether at the provincial level or federal level, that have a get tough attitude towards crime, a higher rate of incarceration based on legislation that's been introduced. And at the same time, you have the fiscal crisis that's facing many provincial and federal governments, and that is that they simply are not allocating the same amount of money to correctional institutions. So what you get is a higher level of incarceration, the lack of money to build more prisons or to build more wings of prisons, and so you get overcrowding. And so overcrowding can strongly affect daily prison life by heightening tensions among inmates and between inmates and correctional officers. It can compromise security. It very much taxes the resources of treatment programs, and this all contributes to security problems within prisons. So as far as overcrowding is concerned, there have one of the most vociferous critics of the Conservative government's law enforcement agenda is that their tough on crime agenda, in particular the mandatory minimum sentencing policy, will lead to even more overcrowding. And so again, this is another issue that one has to look at. And so corrections among all the criminal justice institutions may be impacted more by the tough on crime agenda of the Harper government and the mandatory minimum sentences than any institution. And again, the critics of this policy basically argue that it's going to lead to more overcrowding in prison. And in particular, the last thing we want to do is be putting more Aboriginal people and more people with substance abuse problems and mental health problems in the prison. And that's what the critics argue is going to happen under the law enforcement agenda of the Harper government. So again, corrections is not immune from this policy. In fact, it may be impacted more than any other institution in the criminal justice system. And it's up to you to examine this issue more in depth and determine whether you side with the critics of this policy, or if you in fact believe that that we need more incarceration and tougher sentence of offenders in Canadian society. The last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is the issue of prisoners' rights. Most people feel that once someone is incarcerated, that they have no longer any rights, and certainly they lose a number of their rights when they are in prison. Certainly they lose the right to freedom of movement. But until the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced in the early 1980s, the question of prisoners' rights really was not an issue that was subject to debate. Basically, there was no document or any kind of movement in Canada that looked after the rights of prisoners. It was sort of what they call a hands-off doctrine, in that it was really up to correctional officials and the correctional administration to deal with the extent and scope of rights of prisoners. There was really a general apathy in society to the rights and treatment of prisoners, and the general philosophy was that prisoners no longer had any rights, they simply had privileges. This all changed around 1975 when a federal correctional inmate named Jack McCann was placed in solitary confinement for a whopping 754 days. This eventually came to the attention of the courts, which ruled this to be a highly unusual and unjust punishment. And as a result of this particular case, there was a movement towards ensuring that prisoners have certain rights that should be protected. And so as a result of this case, one of the repercussions was that prisoners can actually now go to the court to fight for their rights if they feel that they're being unjustly served or punished within a correctional institution. Notwithstanding the McCann case, the most significant development in the increasing the rights of prisoners within Canada was the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And not only did this guarantee rights while being processed through the criminal justice system as accused, but prisoners also have rights within prison. And this is a result of not only the McCann decision, but also the Charter of Rights and a number of other developments. But generally, prisoners in Canada have the right to humane treatment, although that's defined very broadly. They have the right to be heard by correctional officials or by the court. They have the right to be informed of allegations against them. They have the right to be informed of the risk assessment, the findings of the risk assessment. They have the right to respond to allegations that have been lodged against them within prison, whether the allegations have respect to violence or bad behavior. So in general, they have the right to know about decisions that have been made about them. And finally, they have the right to an impartial hearing. So it's not good enough that they're informed of allegations against them, but they also have the right to a hearing, a fair and impartial hearing, to adjudicate these allegations. And basically, this carries on to their parole hearing as well. Every inmate has the right to a parole hearing, including the most dangerous offenders. And they have the right for a fair and just hearing in which there is no discrimination in the decision-making process, and that the decision has to be based on some kind of fact or logical reasoning. In other words, an impartial hearing determination cannot be made based on arbitrary reasons. So there's in recent years has definitely been a movement towards the rights of prisoners. And so while many of their rights have been removed by virtue of their incarceration, within that context, they have certain rights. Again, the right to humane treatment, the right to be heard, and the right to an impartial hearing with respect to any allegations or punishment that may be meted out to them while incarcerated.